Winter in the Rocky Mountain frontier was not something you adapted to slowly. It arrived fast, hard, and without mercy. If your cabin was wrong, you found out quickly. If your heating failed, your family paid for it in frozen nights, sickness, and sometimes death. There was no backup plan, no second structure, no emergency fuel delivery. What you built in summer decided whether you survived winter. Most settlers followed the same logic. Tight logs, thick chinking, earth piled against the walls, a large fireplace that burned wood as fast as a man could split it. This system worked just well enough to keep people alive, which is why no one questioned it. Survival breeds tradition, and tradition becomes law. But tradition also hides inefficiency. Every winter, cabins leaked cold air through door seams, wall joints, and roof lines. Fresh air was necessary for breathing and for fire combustion, but it entered wherever it could at full outside temperature. That air dropped straight to the floor, creating cold zones no fire could fully overcome. People compensated by burning more wood, not by fixing the root problem. In one Wyoming basin near the end of the 19th century, a recently arrived mountain man prepared for winter differently. He did not reinforce his walls first. He did not add another layer of chinking. Instead, he picked up a shovel and walked away from his cabin. He started digging a long trench into frozen ground. Neighbors watched with confusion. Digging meant wells or root cellars, not warmth. Digging meant cold, damp earth, everything people tried to keep out of their homes. When asked what the trench was for, the man answered plainly, air. That answer made no sense to anyone listening. Every experienced builder believed the same thing. Bringing outside air into a cabin made it colder. They had seen it their entire lives. Doors opened cold, rushed in. Cracks leaked, children shivered. The idea that air could enter a cabin and make it warmer sounded foolish. But the man digging understood something they didn't measure or discuss. He understood how temperature behaves underground. He understood that winter is mostly a surface problem, and he understood that if air was forced to travel through the earth first, it did not arrive the same way it left. While others sealed their cabins against the cold, he prepared to work with it. And winter was about to test who was right. The digging started in mid-October when the ground was already stiff with frost, and daylight was shrinking fast. Most men spent those weeks fixing roofs, stacking firewood, and sealing every visible crack. This mountain man did none of that at first. He focused on one task, only creating a long, shallow trench that ran away from his cabin instead of toward it. The trench began roughly 60 feet south of the structure and sloped gently downward before rising again near the foundation. It was not random. The direction mattered. The slope mattered. The length mattered. Every foot was deliberate, though no one watching understood why. Experienced homesteaders stopped by to comment. Some mocked him openly. Others tried to warn him. Digging that far and that deep for air made no sense in frontier logic. Air came through doors and cracks for free. Why spend precious energy creating another path for it to enter? The answer lay in what he placed inside the trench. Instead of leaving it open, he lined the channel with flat stones, then fitted hollowed wooden sections end to end. Each piece was shaped by hand, sealed tightly with pitch, and set so no water could pool inside. The pipe sloped just enough to let moisture drain back toward the intake away from the cabin. This was not guesswork. It was learned practice. Where he came from, winters were long and fuel was precious. You did not fight cold blindly. You controlled how it moved. You slowed it. You softened it before it reached living space. The ground was not seen as a source of dampness. It was a source of stability. 6 feet below the surface, the earth barely reacts to winter. While surface air swings violently between heat and cold soil, temperature remains steady. That stability can be borrowed if you know how to ask for it. The pipe ended inside the cabin floor, far from the fireplace. That detail mattered. It ensured no one could claim the warmth came from rising heat. The air entering the cabin would reveal its true condition on its own. When the trench was finally filled and packed down, nothing remained visible except a small screened opening outside and a simple register in the floor. To everyone else, it looked like wasted labor. To the man who built it, the system was already working quietly and visibly before winter even arrived. Frontier builders trusted what they could see and feel. That mindset kept people alive, but it also set limits on what they understood. If something felt cold, it was cold. If something was underground, it was assumed to be damp, dangerous, and hostile to comfort. No one carried thermometers into the soil. No one talked about subsurface temperature. There was simply no reason to. Winter to them came from the air. That assumption was only partly true. Cold air is aggressive, but it is also thin. It changes quickly. The earth, by contrast, is slow, dense, resistant to change. A few feet below the surface, temperature stops swinging with the seasons. It settles into a narrow range and stays there month after month, year after year. This mountain man understood that winter was a surface event. Snow, wind, and bitter air punished what was exposed. Below the frost line, the earth remained calm, holding a temperature far warmer than the air during the worst cold snaps. The buried pipe was not meant to heat air in the way a fire does. It was designed to remove extremes. When freezing outside air entered the intake, it traveled slowly through dozens of feet of soil that refused to freeze. Heat transferred from the surrounding earth into the pipe walls, then into the air itself. By the time that air reached the cabin, it was no longer shockingly cold. It had been moderated, softened, stripped of the worst part of winter. That change mattered more than most people realized. Cabins did not fail because they lacked heat. They failed because they fought constant cold drafts. Fireplaces burned aggressively, but every time fresh air entered through cracks, it sank to the floor and pushed warmth upward and out the chimney. The fire was always chasing loss. This system changed that balance. Air still entered the cabin, but it arrived closer to indoor temperature. It fed the fire without creating violent drafts. It replaced stale air without freezing the floor. The fireplace no longer fought an invisible enemy. The builders watching him work had never thought this way, because they had never needed to. Wood was plentiful when settlements were young. Efficiency was optional. Survival was enough. But when winter stayed longer than expected, when fuel ran low, and when mistakes multiplied under extreme cold efficiency, stopped being a luxury. It became the difference between enduring winter and suffering through it. And winter was about to make that difference impossible to ignore. Early winter arrived the way it usually did. Cold nights, manageable days, fires burned, cabins held together. No one noticed anything unusual at first. The buried air system did not announce itself. It didn't roar, it didn't glow. It worked quietly, which made it easy to dismiss. A few degrees of improvement mean little when temperatures hover just below freezing. People still needed coats indoors. Woodpiles still shrank. From the outside, nothing looked different. Then January arrived. The cold settled in and refused to move. Night temperatures dropped well below zero and stayed there. Wind swept through the basin without pause, finding every weakness in every structure. Wells froze solid. Livestock died standing. Wood disappeared at an alarming rate. Inside most cabins, the same pattern repeated. Fires burned hot and fast. Fresh air rushed in wherever it could, hitting the floor like water poured from a bucket. Warmth rose, cold pooled. People huddled close to the fire because the rest of the room was no longer usable. Families slept in coats. Children shared beds for warmth. Condensation from breathing froze on the walls. It was survival, not comfort. The mountain man's cabin behaved differently. His fire burned lower. It did not need to be fed constantly. The air inside felt steady, not sharp. There were no invisible streams of cold pouring across the floor. The temperature did not collapse when the wind shifted. The buried pipe continued to pull air through the earth, delivering it already tempered by the ground. The fireplace received oxygen without punishment. The cabin held warmth instead of fighting to reclaim it. This was not about luxury, it was about stability. While others burned wood to counter chaos, his system reduced chaos before the fire ever had to respond. Heat stayed where it was produced. The walls mattered again. The fire worked efficiently instead of desperately. Neighbors noticed first through absence. Less smoke from the chimney, fewer trips to the woodpile. No late-night pounding as someone fed the fire every hour. In extreme cold, those details stood out. By the fourth day of sustained deep freeze, the difference could no longer be explained away as luck. The cold was equal for everyone. Only one cabin wasn't losing the fight, and that forced people to ask a question they had avoided all winter. What if the ground was doing more work than the fire ever could? The resistance to the buried air system was not caused by ignorance or laziness. It came from experience, hard-earned experience. Every man in that basin had lived through winters where cold entered a cabin the same way every time through doors cracks and poorly sealed walls. The conclusion seemed obvious: outside air equals cold. Block it and you stay warm. That rule worked often enough to become unquestioned truth. The problem was that the rule was incomplete. What the frontier never separated was where air came from and how it arrived. Cold air rushing through a door at -10 degrees behaves very differently from air that has traveled slowly through 50 feet of earth. One shocks the cabin, the other stabilizes it. Builders assumed that all fresh air was an enemy because they only experienced it under the worst conditions, fast, uncontrolled, and unfiltered. They never slowed it down, never changed its path, never forced it to interact with something more stable than the winter wind. The buried pipe changed the equation before the air ever reached the walls. By the time air entered the cabin, it no longer carried winter's full force. It had given up much of its cold to the surrounding soil. It arrived closer to room temperature not because it was heated, but because it was equalized. This distinction mattered, but it was invisible. People felt cold. They saw frost. They watched wood disappear. But they could not see thermal mass. They could not feel subsurface stability. Without tools or measurements, they relied on instinct, and instinct told them digging invited cold. Even skilled builders struggled with this idea. Experience can become a trap when it stops being tested. 17 cabins built the same way do not prove the method is optimal. They only prove it works well enough to survive. Winter exposed that difference brutally. Cabins without controlled air fought constant pressure from outside conditions. Every gust changed the interior balance. Fires surged and collapsed. Temperatures swung wildly. Efficiency vanished. The buried air system removed the shock. It made incoming air predictable. The fire no longer fought the weather, it worked within a controlled environment. What looked like foolishness was actually restraint. Instead of adding more fire, more wood, and more labor, the system reduced the problem before it entered the cabin. Winter didn't care about tradition. It rewarded whoever understood the system behind the cold. One man in the settlement resisted the idea longer than most. He was not foolish, and he was not cruel. He was confident. He had built cabins across multiple territories, survived decades of winters, and raised families inside structures he trusted. To him, the buried pipe was unnecessary complication. Good walls, a good firebox, and enough wood had always been enough. Until this winter, as the cold stretched on his confidence began to cost him. His fire burned constantly, yet the far corners of his cabin stayed near freezing. His children slept close to the hearth, rotating positions through the night. He fed the fire every 45 minutes and still woke to frost on the inside walls. Wood that should have lasted weeks vanished in days. Across the basin, the mountain man's chimney told a different story. Thin smoke, steady fire, no frantic chopping after dark, no visible struggle. That contrast mattered more than words ever could. Certainty is comfortable until reality refuses to cooperate. The experienced builder could explain every flaw in the buried system, in theory, condensation, freezing, rot, but none of those failures appeared. The pipe did not freeze, the cabin did not draft, the fire did not rage out of control. Finally, during the worst of the cold, he did something rare on the frontier. He asked to see the system. Inside the cabin, the difference was immediate. The air did not bite, the floor was not icy, the walls felt warmer to the touch. His fingers ached as they thawed. There was no trick of placement or hidden heat source, just a modest fire and a steady flow of tempered air rising from the floor. That moment mattered because it forced a recalculation. Experience had taught him how to survive winter. It had not taught him how to minimize suffering. His methods worked, but they were inefficient. They consumed time, fuel, and comfort unnecessarily. The buried air system did not replace skill, it refined it. Certainty had kept him alive, but certainty had also blinded him to improvement. Winter did not punish him for being wrong, it punished him for refusing to question what he already believed. That lesson spread faster than the technique itself. Because on the frontier, nothing carries weight like proof measured in warmth, wood saved and children sleeping through the night. Once the certainty broke, everything changed quickly. Frontier communities were skeptical by nature, but they were not stubborn when survival was at stake. Men who had doubted the buried air system did not suddenly become believers because of theory. They believed because they had stood inside a cabin during extreme cold and felt the difference in their bones. Questions replaced ridicule. How deep was the trench? How long did the pipe need to be? What angle prevented water from freezing inside? Could the system work in rocky soil? Would different woods last longer underground? The answers were practical, not philosophical. The pipe had to reach below the frost line. It had to be long enough for air to exchange heat with the earth. It had to slope gently so moisture drained away from the cabin. Joints had to be sealed tightly. Shortcuts failed. Careful work succeeded. What surprised many was how little wood the system saved without changing daily life. No new routines. No constant adjustments. Once built, it worked on its own. The fire burned the same way, but it burned less. That mattered. Wood was time. Wood was labor. Wood was safety. Every log not burned was a log available for the next storm, the next winter, or the next illness that kept a man from chopping. Within weeks, neighbors began planning their own versions. Some waited until spring. Others started digging in frozen ground, knowing the work would pay itself back. The idea spread the way frontier knowledge always did, quietly through observation and results. No one claimed ownership of the idea. There were no instructions written down at first. Men walked the trench line with their boots. They knelt by the intake and felt the air. They stood over the floor register and felt warmth rising that had no flame behind it. Each builder adapted the system to his land. Longer pipes where soil was shallow, stone-lined trenches where ground stayed wet, different materials where timber varied. The principle stayed the same. The frontier did not reward perfection. It rewarded systems that worked under pressure. By the next winter, the settlement was divided into two kinds of cabins, those still fighting drafts with fire alone, and those that had learned to let the earth absorb the worst of winter before it ever crossed the threshold. The buried pipe was no longer a joke. It was simply good building. Once the buried air system proved itself, it did not stay frozen in its original form. Frontier builders were practical. They did not copy blindly. They tested, adjusted, and improved anything that saved labor or reduced risk. Some cabins had soil that was too rocky for deep trenches. Those builders extended the pipe farther to compensate for reduced depth. Others discovered that clay-heavy ground transferred heat more slowly, so they increased pipe length to allow more time for temperature exchange. Men with access to metal experimented with salvaged copper or iron sections, learning quickly that material mattered less than placement and airflow. One improvement appeared almost immediately. Builders realized the system did more than help in winter. During summer, surface air could become stifling inside a sealed cabin. Heat built up. Food spoiled faster. Sleep became difficult. By reversing or limiting airflow through the buried pipe cooler, earth-tempered air could be pulled inside, lowering interior temperatures without a single extra tool. The ground did not care whether it was winter or summer. It always offered moderation. Some families added simple wooden dampers. Others used removable plugs. Nothing complicated, just enough control to decide when the system worked and when it rested. Cabins became more stable year-round, not just survivable in winter. Failures happened too. Men who ignored slope watched condensation freeze and block airflow. Those who buried pipes too shallow gained little benefit. Green wood warped. Poor seals leaked. The system punished shortcuts mercilessly. It rewarded patience. Over time, a clear pattern emerged. Success required four things: depth below, frost lines, sufficient length, steady airflow, and drainage. Miss one and the system failed. Respect all four and it worked reliably. Trading posts began stocking materials specifically for underground air passages. New settlers were advised to dig first, build second. The buried pipe became part of quiet frontier knowledge passed along without ceremony. What began as one man's strange experiment turned into a regional standard, not because it was clever, but because it was dependable. The earth never changed its temperature. People simply learned how to listen to it. As decades passed, the frontier changed. Roads improved. Rail lines pushed deeper into the mountains. Coal, then oil, then electricity arrived in places that once relied entirely on muscle and wood. Heating became easier, faster, and far less personal. With that convenience, the buried air system slowly disappeared. Why dig 60 feet of trench when a furnace could be installed in a day? Why think about airflow and soil depth when a thermostat could simply demand heat? The old methods were not proven wrong. They were simply made unnecessary by cheap energy, or so it seemed. What was lost was not the technique itself, but the mindset behind it. Frontier builders designed systems that worked with natural forces because they had no choice. Later generations designed systems that overpowered those forces because fuel appeared limitless. For a while, that approach worked. Then energy became expensive again. In the late 20th century, engineers facing rising fuel costs and environmental limits began searching for passive solutions. They studied ways to reduce heating and cooling loads without burning more resources. And quietly, without much acknowledgement, they rediscovered the same principle that Mountain Man had used generations earlier. They gave it new names: earth tubes, ground-coupled ventilation, geothermal air exchange. They ran tests, published papers, filed patents. They praised the concept as modern innovation, noting how air traveling through Earth below the frost line naturally stabilized in temperature. Homes using these systems required less fuel. Temperatures stayed consistent. Air quality improved. Everything matched what frontier builders had already proven. The difference was materials and control. Plastic replaced wood, fans replaced natural draft, sensors replaced instinct, but the physics never changed. The Earth still moderated extremes. Air still equalized when given time and contact. The irony was that nothing new had been discovered. Something old had been remembered. Progress had not eliminated the need for wisdom. It had merely postponed its return. The buried air pipe was never a relic of ignorance. It was a response to limits. When limits returned through cost, climate, or necessity, the idea resurfaced just wearing modern tools. The Earth had been offering the same help the entire time. It had simply been ignored once fuel made ignorance affordable. The buried air system was never really about pipes, trenches, or clever construction. Those were just tools. The real lesson was about how people survive when resources are limited and mistakes are expensive. On the frontier, you could not afford to be impressed by your own experience. You could not afford to assume the old way was the best way simply because it was familiar. Winter did not care how many cabins you had built. It only cared whether your system worked when conditions turned hostile. That is what the mountain man understood. He did not fight winter head-on. He reduced its power before it entered his home. He accepted that some forces are too large to defeat directly and focused instead on controlling how they interact with daily life. That approach saved wood, saved labor, and saved comfort at a time when all three mattered. Modern life often hides inefficiency. A furnace masks poor insulation. A utility bill hides wasted energy. Discomfort is softened by convenience not solved. On the frontier, waste was visible. You saw it in empty woodpiles and exhausted bodies. Efficiency was not an abstract goal, it was survival. The Earth below the frost line still behaves the same way today. It holds steady temperature regardless of surface chaos. It absorbs extremes without complaint. That stability remains available to anyone willing to work with it rather than against it. The deeper lesson is humility. The mountain man was ignored not because he was wrong, but because he challenged certainty. His neighbors were not foolish, they were experienced, and experience when untested can become a barrier to improvement. Frontier history is full of examples like this. Indigenous knowledge dismissed as primitive, immigrant techniques labeled backward, old practices abandoned until crisis forces people to look again. The knowledge never disappears. It waits. What kept that cabin warm was not a trick. It was attention. Attention to how air moves, how Earth behaves, how systems interact over time. Winter is still unforgiving. Resources are still finite, and the ground beneath our feet is still offering the same quiet help it always has. The frontier lesson is simple and uncomfortable. Sometimes the smartest solution looks wrong until conditions become severe enough to prove it right.